In the first book of the Chronicles, we read in verse 1, Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech. Verse 4, Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshach, and Tiras. Verse 6. Verse 10. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be mighty upon the earth. Verse 19. And unto Eber were born two sons, and the name of one was Peleg, because in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Verse 42. The sons of Ezer, Bilhan, and Zavan, and Jachan, the sons of Dishan, Uz, and Aaron. Chapter 2, verse 11. And Nahshon begat Salma, and Salma begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, and Obed begat Jesse. Verse 41, chapter 2. And Shalem begat Jachimah, Jachimah begat Elisham. Chapter 3, verse 16. And the sons of Jehoiakim, Jehonani, his son, Zedekiah, his son. Chapter 4, verse 18. And his wife, Jehudiah, bare Jared, the father of Gedor, and Heber, the father of Socho, and Jekuthiel something, the father of Zahanaho. And these the sons of Mithniah, the daughter of Pharaoh, and Merad took. Verse 5, chapter 5, verse 5. Micah his son, Reah his son, Baal his son, Bera his son, whom Tilgath-Pileser, king of Assyria, carried away captive. He was prince of the Reubenites. Chapter 6. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And the scriptures go on and on and on. Have you ever wondered why in the world we have lists like that in the scripture? How many of you have been doing your daily Bible reading and you were doing really, really good? You were really, really faithful. You were doing it like once every 4 or 5 days. I mean, you were breaking all kinds of records for your own discipline, and you come to the book of the First Chronicles and everything breaks down because we have so-and-so beget so-and-so who beget so-and-so who beget so-and-so, and pretty soon you're doing something different than reading who beget so-and-so and who beget so-and-so. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever wondered why those lists are in the Bible with name after name that we cannot produce over and over and over again? Have you ever noticed that it's not just in the book of the First Chronicles that there are these listing of names? In fact, you can go to the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 5, and in Genesis chapter 10, and in Genesis chapter 11. You will see lists of name after name after name. The same thing happens in the book of Numbers, chapter 26, and in Ruth, chapter 4. You will see all of those lists of names, and you begin to wonder, was somebody being paid by the word for them to include all of these names that you and I cannot pronounce today? Maybe they could in those days. And you begin to think this is just filler so that we might have a thicker Bible, so that we might be able to carry it and look spiritual because of how big the Bible is. Well, you might begin to think that until you come to the New Testament and you see the very beginning of the New Testament. How does it begin? Well, in Matthew chapter 1, isn't there a listing of names there? Some of the names are a little more popular. Some of the names that you and I may be able to recognize just a little bit more easily. But it says the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. It goes on and on. And then again, we find it in Luke chapter 3, another listing of name after name after name. Have you ever wondered why it is that God has chosen to give us a listing of names that we cannot pronounce, and somehow we are supposed to recognize the value, the importance, and the spiritual nature, the inspirational nature of that to change our lives? Ever wonder about that? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think most importantly, it is a demonstration of God's omnipotence and God's sovereignty over all things in the universe to show us that what He said He was going to do, He, in fact, has done and will continue to do. In addition to that, I think it's very important that the Christian faith is connected to history. We can go back and we can trace historically on another canvas, not just some kind of spiritual canvas, but we can track the work of God on a historical canvas, and we are one of the few, quote, religions that doesn't begin a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. The Scriptures are constantly telling us, in the reign of so-and-so, in such and so, this is what happened, which allows you and I to have confidence to go back and look up such and so and what he was doing in that time frame and have an understanding of that. Now, those are the two main reasons I think that God gives us those lists. Number one, to demonstrate his sovereignty and his omnipotence and his power over all things by seeing those names. Then number two, to give us a historical perspective that our faith is not anti-intellectual, it's not anti-rational, but in fact it does fit within all things in history. But I think there's a smaller reason that I want to emphasize during our time this morning, and that is this. I believe in part that those lists are there to remind us that we are not the first. I think those lists are to remind us that there were people who came before us which allow us the benefit of all the things that we have, knowing that there was something before us and that we are not the beginning and the end of all things. You see, many of us believe this. We would never say this, but this is what many of us believe, that the world did not begin until we arrived. And somehow you and I, when we were born, we were the culmination of the evolutionary process because ta-da, here we are, and now life can really begin. Things really get started once you and I show up. If you don't believe this, you can look at teenagers. And teenagers do their very best to pretend that they are the first ever to arrive. I've told you the stories in the past that my parents, when I was in junior high school, became very, very uncool. I don't know what happened to them, but they seemed like normal human beings. Then I got into junior high school, and somehow driving that 1976 red Chevy Impala that was 2 blocks long was doing something to hurt my image on campus at junior high school. And so I was trying to get my parents to park a block away from the school and let me out so that it would appear that I just spontaneously appeared in the universe and that now I can be there and everything is okay and I'm the beginning of all things. Have you ever done anything like that? Or maybe your children have had you do that kind of a thing. Many of us think that we begin, the universe begins when we arrive, and that everybody ought to be searching for us and everybody ought to be bowing down to our wishes. And I think that one of the things that God wants to remind us is that we are not the first. And I started thinking about this this week. And when I started thinking about this concept this week of this listing of name after name after name, I really began to think of, and you know how strange I am, the things that I think of when I'm pondering deep philosophical things. But when I started thinking about those, the first thing that I thought of were these pews. Now, I know you can see the connection, but for those of you who can't see the connection, let me go ahead and build that connection for you. How many of you this morning, when you came in, you brought your own pew to sit on? Anybody do that? Okay. Most of you probably did not bring your own pew to sit on, and most of us, except for Greg over there sitting in the chairs, most of the rest of us are sitting on the pews. And I really began to think about that every week you and I show up and we sit on these pews and we expect them to be there for our benefit. I mean, wouldn't that be strange if you came in church one Sunday morning and we had taken out all of the pews? Wouldn't that be fun? If you've ever picked up one of these pews, you would know, no, that would not be fun to move these pews. But I started thinking about that at some point, since I have been here, these pews have been here. How many of you, since you've been coming to this church, these pews have been here? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you have been coming to this church before these pews were sitting where they're sitting, right? There's a few of you in this room right here, okay. Some of you have done that. And most of us, though, that came in, these pews were already here. We had no concept of the pew, whether it was going to be here. And yet somebody, at some point in our history, in our experience of reality, at some point, through one of those doors or maybe some other kind of way, somebody walked in that door with these pews and they set them here. In fact, if I understand the history of this church, when they moved into this building some 20-something, almost 30 years now, that this church was debt-free congregation. If I've heard the stories, that the church only purchased pews as they had money. That's what I understand. Is that true, Dave Grisman? You're back there? And so there's like a week, there's only like 2 pews, and everybody else has to stand up, and I guess that's a way to raise funds, that if you want to come and sit, you got to contribute some more funds to buy some more pews, and you kind of know that's not the way that it worked, but you kind of do that process. And I started thinking about that. You and I every week come in here and sit in these pews, and we have no concept of the person who moved a pew in. Now think about that for just, I know it is a little warped. I understand that. I've never promised that I'm not warped. But you just think about that you're sitting on a pew that somebody that you don't know brought into this room, and you are trusting that that pew is going to work. But it gets even worse than that. Because that pew just didn't spontaneously appear in the parking lot, but that pew was put on a truck, and it was brought by a truck driver that you and I don't know anything about and probably never met. And that truck driver drove from wherever he drove. I'm assuming it was a truck driver, not in a Honda Civic or something like that. They moved the pews in. I was hoping they're kind of like a big truck is what I'm thinking. But somebody drove that truck to bring that pew to this campus that we don't know them. And then somebody else that we probably don't know, unless there was a pew bringing in day, and maybe there was, Dave, you can check me after the service, but allow me to have my illustration for this service, then I'll fix it the next. But somebody that we don't know drove that pew from someplace to here, and then somebody else got in that truck and moved that pew, probably at least 2 of them, or as heavy as these things are, 7 of them, got in, they brought this pew in, and now that pew has been sitting there, and you and I get the benefit of sitting in that pew based on people that we don't even know, but it gets worse than that. Because we know no truck driver in his right mind is going to just drive someplace without somebody telling him where he's going to drive to bring that pew to where it was so that somebody could open that back of that truck up, get that pew out and bring it so that you and I can sit in it today. But then it kind of gets even worse than that. There is somebody at some factory who actually had to make these pews. Now, I don't know how they make pews. I could probably Google that or YouTube it, and we could probably find I could show you a little video on how pews are made, but that'd be kind of a little boring for you because I think you could understand this general concept. But there's probably a line of people someplace back in 1843 whenever we bought these pews. I don't know how long ago it was, but they're in this factory, and they're making this pew made out of wood, I'm assuming, or at least some kind of plywood kind of thing. And they're working in a factory some Tuesday or some Wednesday, and they're working on this, and they're putting it together, they're cutting things, and they're shaving things, or whatever you do when you make stuff, and they're doing that in that process, and then it gets put in some kind of factory or some kind of warehouse, and then somebody makes a phone call to a truck driver and says, hey, go pick up so-and-so, this number of pews, and then the guy picks it up, and there's people who pack it in the truck at the location, and then there's somebody who drives it here, and there's somebody else who gets it. There are a lot of people involved in you sitting down there today that you've probably never, ever thought of. But then it kind of gets even worse than that. There's some lumberjack someplace. Somewhere. I have no idea. I'm assuming this is real wood, so I don't know. But there's some lumberjack someplace who's out there one day in this field, not a field, because that would be no trees in a field, but in this forest that's out there, and they're cutting down trees. And these guys are cutting down trees, put it on a billet truck or something like that. At least we had those in Arkansas. You have a billet trucks up here. Anybody know I'm talking about a billet truck? No? Okay, never mind. I forget where I am sometimes. But these guys are cutting these trees down, loading them on this big truck. We call it a billet truck in Arkansas, but it's this big truck, and they're moving that to a factory, and it's a woodworking factory, and they're taking trees, and they're making logs out of it and wood, and they're sending that. And you get the point now? Can I stop this illustration? But you kind of get that? Yeah, so please stop the illustration, Pastor. We know we get your idea. And I know it doesn't seem like a really big deal, but you are sitting there because there are literally, if you really think about it, dozens, if not hundreds of people who worked not knowing you and I to provide you and I a benefit so that every week you come in, you get to sit in these most comfortable things in all the world, these pews, right? They're so comfortable you and I have pews in our houses, don't we, that we sit and watch television from, right? No, we don't. But I started thinking about that. When I read this list, I was doing some devotional reading and come across those chapters, and I go, man, why isn't this in here, God? Part of it's to remind us that we are not the first. But it extends beyond just the pews. You see, if I understand the history of this church correctly, back in 1943, which would be 67 years ago almost, 67, 68 years ago, there were some people that got together and said, you know what, there needs to be another church in this community. Now, you historians, what was happening in 1943? World War II, is that correct? It was a great time in American history, right? Everybody had lots of stuff. They had plenty of food. They had plenty of everything, all right? I mean, it was just a time of great expanse, a time of great bounty during that history and during that time. Was that the case? Those of you who were around in 1943? No, it wasn't, was it? There was even rationing of resources. I've been told stories about you couldn't get as much sugar as you wanted. You had to get your little sugar cards. Is that true? Shake your heads if somebody remembers those kind of things. You had to get little cards, and you couldn't buy a new car every year like you and I do because there was a limit on that. You couldn't get new tires when you wanted tires, from what I understand. All these things were limited. How well would that go in American culture today? But that's a whole other concept. But during that time, some people got together and said, you know what? We need to begin, and I believe God put a work in their heart, that we need to begin a new congregation, and you and I, because of that effort that they made and all the efforts of other literally hundreds and probably thousands of people have brought us to where we are today, and many of us think that we just showed up for the first day, and ta-da, the church began, the world began because we're here. And that's just not the case. In fact, many of you probably this past week were reminded once again that not only do we exist as a congregation because of those who did things before us, but we even as a nation are here because of what people have sacrificed so that you and I can get where we are today. It's been Veterans Week. Have you noticed here in Branson? In fact, anybody here because of Veterans Week? You're out of town and you're here because of Veterans Week? Okay, they all went home. I thought if they were here on Thursday, they'd make it through the weekend because with Veterans Day in the middle of the week, it's kind of hard to know where to honor that. And last week we did Mission and Me. But we always remember those who gave their life in service for our country. But we don't always remember all of the veterans that have served in all the wars. I pulled some information just this past week about the number of veterans, and this was from a document, a teacher's guide that was created by the Veterans Administration for our school teachers to teach this. And here's what they said. World War II, there were 4 million men who served worldwide. You can see the other data on that, and when this was printed, there was still one living veteran from World War I. I don't know if that's still the case, but when it was printed, he was that one person that was there. You think about the 4 million that were involved there. You think about the number of servicemen, 16 million American servicemen in World War II with over 2 million living veterans, although that number is declining every day. You think about all the servicemen that did that. You think of the Korean War, which was receiving some publicity this particular year. Those who had served in that, almost 2.5 million living veterans who've served in that conflict. In Vietnam, over 7.5 million living veterans who served in that war, in that conflict. In the Gulf War, over 2 million living veterans that served in that time. And then ultimately in our war on terror, couldn't find a good solid number on the living veterans or the number that have served, but all of those added up. Today, there are about 3 million active or reservists who are serving our country today, and almost 25 million veterans alive today, somewhere between 23 and 25 million veterans. And we owe a debt of gratitude to all of those, whether they served in combat or whether they served in peacetime, that brought what we have today as a nation. And I know that we've done this a lot in our congregation, especially when we come to Memorial Day and things like that. But I think it's always appropriate for us to kind of pause and recognize and remember our veterans for their service. And so I would just ask you right now, if you served in the military in any form, shape, or fashion, if you would just stand so we can acknowledge that today. Can we do that in the middle of the sermon? I know it means somebody got to wake up and that kind of thing. But see, you look at all these men and women who have served us. Thank you. We appreciate your service. You're very valuable to us. We want to thank you for that service because we know that as a nation, we could not be who we are without the sacrifice of those who have come before us, whether that is a church or whether that is a nation. But the truth is, we wouldn't have a nation to even defend except for these people who got on a boat. And you know where I'm going if you know me, church. I'm just obsessed with Thanksgiving, obsessed with this concept of being thankful to God, but also the recognition of the sacrifice. Many of you who have been in this congregation for my tenure know that we talk every year about the 102 people who got on a boat called the Mayflower and cross the ocean in order to reach a place that they can worship freely. Of the 102 on board, based on whatever documentation you want to read, there were either 37 or there were 45 people who got on that boat for one reason. It wasn't to come see a new land. It wasn't to find value or find property or make it big, but there were 37 or 45 people from a congregation in Leiden, Holland, who got on that boat so that they might be able to worship God the way that they thought God wanted them to worship Him. And they get on this boat, and you're going to hear many stories of the next couple of weeks in between football games of the history of Thanksgiving, and they're going to say that most of the people came, and it wasn't a big deal. They didn't come for religious reasons. They just came so they could play football for free, or they could eat turkey, and they're going to give you all these different things, and I'm going to scream at my television set like I do every time this happens. But the majority of the people, not the majority numerically, but the reason for them leaving, the reason for that trip on the Mayflower had nothing to do with finances. The trip was begun by that congregation in Holland for the express reason of creating a place where people could worship freely. And yes, they invited some other people to go. They had some trouble with one of the boats, the Speedwell. You probably know the story. One of the boats, they were going to take two boats, the Mayflower and the Speedwell sprung a leak. We don't know if that was because the captain didn't really want to go on that trip, but the 120 plus that were supposed to go on those two boats, some of them backed out at the last minute, and then a few others, the Mayflower was only supposed to carry 90 on the original trip, and so 12 more people jumped on board from the Speedwell and kind of made even greater difficulty in crossing the ocean. But they crossed that ocean. The reason for the trip, the reason for the financing of it was so that people might come to this place and worship freely. And at the end of that first winter, only 53 remained of that 102 in that first year. First winter, 53 out of the 102 are all that were left. And of the 17 married couples, only 7 husbands and 3 wives survived that very first winter. And they came not to make a lot of money, not to come to a new land. They just simply wanted to worship God freely. In fact, you can go back and read the historical accounts of this, but William Bradford, who was the second governor of Plymouth Colony because the first man died in that first winter, he wrote this about the Pilgrims. He said, "They cherished a great hope, an inward zeal of laying good foundations, or at least of making some way towards it, for the propagation and advancement of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world." My friends, it doesn't get any more clear than that for the reason for the sacrifice of the Pilgrims to come here in the first place. He goes on to write that even though they should be but stepping stones to others in the performance of so great a work. That was in about 1621. Almost 400 years ago, we're just about 10 years away from celebrating the 400th anniversary of these people, these pilgrims, making such a sacrifice, and they should be but stepping stones to others in the performance of so great a work. And I know I'm not doing a lot of scripture, and I know I'm a little nutty on this, and I know you just got to forgive me, but I get tired of us thinking that we just showed up here and there wasn't the sacrifice of those who came before us. And they have handed us something. They've handed us a way of thinking, a way of living, a way of acting, a way for the kingdom of Christ and the gospel to go forth throughout the world. And some days I begin to think that we are about to fumble that ball that they've handed us. And for 400 years, that has been very effective. And you and I have got to figure out in these days how we are going to respond. How are we going to continue this great advancement of the kingdom of Christ throughout all of the world, and that you and I may have to be stepping stones for others? Yeah, I've talked about a couple of stepping stones. I don't know if you're familiar with stepping stones, the concept, but they're pretty simple. They're stones you step on. Pretty tough. I know. I'm rocket science. I know. I'm good, aren't I? I'm just smart. I got a doctorate and everything. I understand that. But I kind of talked to you about some of the stepping stones that have been in place for us. I mean, it's really the pilgrims, the ones who make that first stepping stone for us. They come from a time when people are being persecuted because of their faith. Now, it's quite interesting. All the faith is related to Christianity, but there's still persecution between all of those, and they give their lives in order for a people to be free, to come to a new nation, create a new nation, eventually some 200 years, almost 150 years after that time, to create this nation based upon very similar foundations, and all they were stepping stones. They were not the end. They recognized that what they were doing is probably in 1 Chronicles 2, not 1 Chronicles 7. They were just a piece of what God was doing. But they willingly went and they willingly did what they were supposed to do. And since that time, there have been others that have come behind them. There's been our military, which sometimes has to go out and defend those reasons and those rationales and those foundational principles. And men have gone out there and they have died, so that you and I might have the freedom to choose whether or not we're going to wear a Nike or whether we're going to wear a Reebok or whether we're going to wear an Adidas. And they pay for it with their life, and they become a stepping stone for this great culture that God has created, this Christian-based culture. And then there are people who make sacrifices within the church so that they might have a church for us to come and be a part of. How many of you were here when this building was built and you were here on the first Sunday that you moved in? Raise your hands really high. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Are there more than 18 of us here? This means yes, this means no. Are there more than 18 of us here? Yeah, there are. Why? We get the benefit of the sacrifice of those who've gone before us. They have become a stepping stone for us in this congregation, and that is wonderful, and that is great, and we're so thankful and so glad. But you know what we have in our hands today ourselves? With our lives and who we are and what we have a stepping stone. And you and I have to decide what we're going to do with our lives, whether we're going to be consumers of what we have been given, or whether we will be producers for those who come behind us. And it's really hard, isn't it? Sometimes you will see here in Branson a bumper sticker, and it says, "I'm spending my kids' inheritance." Have you ever seen one of those bumper stickers right there? Yeah. Yeah, my parents keep putting one on their car, and I keep taking that off. It's just a real kind of a difficult thing. They're supposed to call me if they spend more than $500 at this point in their life, because I want to approve that purchase, make sure they're getting good value for us when they pass away. We'll be able to do all this. We've got those kind of details. But there's that concept of what do we do with what we've been given? Do we just simply consume all that we have? Or do we become a stepping stone for whatever comes next? How much time do I have? No, I'll be quiet. I'm already meddling today. I'm going to be in trouble after this message anyway. And here's the tough part, though. I can't tell you what that stepping stone for you is supposed to be. Because, see, sometimes you and I get caught up with doing things for God. And we begin to think, well, what should I do for God? Can I tell you, God's not really that interested in what you're going to do for Him. He's really more interested in who you are and that you might walk with Him in these days. Because these are really kind of confusing days, aren't they? I mean, really, how are we supposed to be Christian in the culture that we have today? I know for many, the culture that we have today is not the culture that you grew up in. And there's always a challenge of what do we do? What do we respond with our life? I love the story that Brian McLaren tells, and I don't agree with Brian's theology, but he tells the story of this bridge that was built, and I think it was in Costa Rica or Honduras or someplace like that. And the bridge was a very expensive bridge. The Japanese had given this bridge as a gift to this particular country, and they had built a road that connected this beautiful bridge. It was a multi-hundred-million-dollar bridge, one of the beautiful bridges, and they had built this road to this bridge that was crossing over this major river that was just keeping people from being on either side. The country didn't have the resources, and so Japan came in as a gift and a gesture, built this bridge so that natives would be able to go from one side to the other side. It was a modern bridge by all American standards, 4-lane highway, 2-lane highway, something like that, and it crossed over this river. And it was beautiful, and the people were thankful for that bridge. They were now able to connect with family and friends, and they were able to do commerce in a way they were never able to do ever before. And yet a hurricane came through, and that hurricane dropped about 500 years worth of rain in this region in about a week. And that water was so much with that hurricane that the water washed out the approach road to the bridge, and it washed out the recess road from the bridge so that the bridge is standing there by itself, and there's no way to get to the bridge, there's no way to get off the bridge. But then it got even worse. The water was so much that the river that used to be underneath the bridge was relocated about 2 miles to the east. And there are some beautiful pictures of this gorgeous bridge over nothing. And the people have a decision to make. What do you do with a bridge that goes nowhere? That's over no river, with no approach and no egress. It's just there, and the river is 2 miles away. There are two strategies that you can invoke. One is that you can work very diligently to get the river back underneath the bridge. Or you can what? Build a new bridge. And one of the challenges that I think all of us face today is that many of us spend a lot of our energy and effort trying to get the cultural river back under the bridge of church the way that we expect it to be, the way that we want it to be, the way that it used to be. And we're trying to spend all of our effort to get the culture back underneath the bridge instead of building a new bridge to our culture. And so the question for all of us to ask, and I can't tell anybody what to do. I'm trying to figure out how to live in these days myself, much less tell someone else. But the next time you pick up the scriptures, and it may be months and years from now when you do this, it may not be this week, but the next time you're reading through the Bible, and you come to the book of Chronicles, or you come to the book of Matthew, or you come to Ruth, and you see one of those passages, and you see all of those names, I want you to think about something. And I want you to ask the Lord as you walk with Him in your daily life, Lord, how can I be that stepping stone for what comes behind me? How do I set up next? Next for this congregation? Yeah, maybe. Next for our nation? Yes, maybe. But how do you set up next for the kingdom of God? I'll close with this and we'll be done. This past week I got to be a part of a meeting because of you, and that meeting was of church planters across the state of Missouri. And there are some changes that are coming within the National Convention, the Missouri Baptist Convention, and they're trying to rethink about how to do church planting and the value and the importance of planting new churches so that people might come to know the gospel in a language and in a way that they might understand it. And we started talking about some numbers and the desire to see, this many churches planted by this date and so many churches planted by that date. And some of the years that they were talking about were the years 2020. What do we do to plant so many churches by the year 2020? And somebody came up with the concept of thinking about, well, let's start praying for the people who are going to be planting churches in 2020. And you know what we came to realize? That if the average age of a church planter is about 25, and 2020 is about, 10 years from now? About how old are those church planters that we're praying for right now? And then we started looking about how many churches we needed at 2030. And again, thinking if the average age of the church planter was 25, and we're in 2030, where are those church planters now? They're in our nurseries. And I know that preschoolers, they slobber. I know that. And I know that you'd rather be with adults than with our little preschoolers sometimes. But if we're going to become stepping stones for the future, that doesn't begin when people get to be 25. It begins when they're 5. And I know teenagers are loud. And I know that even now at my age, I'm becoming a little intimidated by teenagers myself. But if we're thinking about the future, the investment on church planting and pastors and all those things, it doesn't happen to people that are grown up like you and I and are mature and are spiritual, all those things. It's happening in youth ministry, student ministry, in children's ministry, and preschool ministry. And I called Miss Teresa on the way back from that trip, and I said, Miss Teresa, we've got to start praying for our preschoolers. We've got to start praying for our children. Not that they just get saved and they come to know Christ, but God will use them to change the world. And that God might raise up church planters out of our congregation, out of our nursery. I know that sounds weird, doesn't it? And that God will raise up powerful men and women of God who will leave everything to follow Him, whether it's in Asia or whether it's in South America, that we start praying for our children and preschoolers, that God would raise them up from among us today. See, that's what it means to be stepping stones. And as you read the Chronicles or you get caught in one of those other passages where you're reading all of those names, I want you to think about that. One day there is an extension of that book that's being written. And there may be, in the grand scheme of what God is doing, not in the Scriptures, your name is not going to appear, but in all the things that God is doing, your name will appear as just one of many, many stepping stones on the process of God accomplishing His will and His power. And I just wonder what you want written beside your name. Faithful, producer, or consumer. You know, in the Scriptures there's oftentimes a listing of kings, and it'll just say something like, and he was what? A bad king. No passages like that. Or he was a good king. He followed God's will, or he did not know God. Those things are being written about you and I today. And it all begins with a decision and the question of, will I be a stepping stone, or will I consume all my resources and no one will step on me? We have so much to be thankful for. May those who come behind us, may they find us faithful as well. Would you bow your heads, close your eyes?